what would be some of the advantages, perhaps, or some of the architectural changes that might be necessary if I wanted to instead go to a client-server system? So for any of you in a workstation environment, you know that you have got a computer, this workstation, that might be attached to several instruments in your laboratory. In this example, I've got it attached to 4 HPLCs. And I've got additional HPLCs that are attached to additional workstations. Now, each one of these workstations are silos. They are islands of information. If I want to be able to use this HPLC, I have to walk up to this first workstation. I cannot go to this workstation down below to operate this HPLC. Now, even though I can take advantage of my network to be able to maybe do some rudimentary things, there's no automated way for me to be able to share things like data, methods, sequences, even the administration of each one of those workstations. Let's say that I would like to turn on, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment, I'd like to turn on an ability to be able to track exactly who's doing what with my workstation. Well, if I want to do that in a workstation environment, I have to do that 3 separate times. I cannot take, and many times IT will come to me and go, aren't there just a couple of files I can copy from one workstation to another in order to make them an exact copy of that workstation? The answer to that question is unfortunately no. They are designed to be islands, silos of information, and islands were not necessarily designed to duplicate each other. So there is not an easy way of being able to do that. But let's say instead we take this same type of idea and we now start to leverage a little bit more of our network inside of our laboratories. And we can take advantage of that by adding all of those instruments instead of to individual workstations to something called AICs. These are Agilent Instrument Controllers. These are designed to attach to instruments and automatically allow you to be able to use those instruments from anywhere in your infrastructure. So you'll notice here, these AICs, they actually don't have a mouse or a keyboard or even a display or a monitor. They're not typically designed to be used as the interface to run those instruments. Instead, those clients are here, and they can now be anywhere in my infrastructure. So I can have a client sitting in the laboratory, which I still certainly want because I want to be able to make sure that all of my autosampler vials are going in the right place in my autosampler. But maybe I would also like to have a client sitting at my office. I'd like to also have a client sitting on my laptop computer. All of that is now possible. Also, because of the fact that all of these instruments are connected to a centralized storage location, that means that all of the information from all my LCs, my GCs, my GC and LC single quad mass specs are going directly to this central storage location. That means I can go to any CDS client anywhere in my infrastructure, and I can then look at and do either data acquisition or data analysis from any of these CDS clients. Well, what are some of the benefits for having this type of a distributed architecture? Well, first of all, if I am a IT or system administrator, I have the central administration of all the roles, instruments, and users from only one location. So unlike these workstations on the left, where I would have to do it 3 separate times for each one of these workstations, 1 per workstation. Instead here, I can assign users, groups, roles, instruments in one location, and it would populate down to all of the system with only doing it once. There are database backups for all of my data, and as soon as I say a database backup, that backup routine falls squarely on your IT. It falls off of managers and chemists' shoulders because you guys don't do those types of backups. It's an IT responsibility. There are system administration and diagnostic reports that are available out of the box within the system to see how things are currently operating within your organization. I can lock any of these instruments from any client. This is a very important aspect because, again, let's say my client here is sitting in my office, which is 3 doors down from my laboratory. I'd like to start this HPLC. Unfortunately, I don't realize that my colleague has got the pump head out and they're currently changing out the pump seals. So before they begin that type of process, they lock that instrument. So even though I can't see it from my CDS client, when I try to launch it, it doesn't give me that opportunity to be able to launch that client until my colleague has finished with whatever they're doing and unlocks that instrument for me to be able to use. Also, the rollout and scalability of this system is far easier, along with redundancy in case something fails. And let's face it, especially in this last year, we all have to put a little bit more emphasis on what happens if I can't do something. So let me give you a good concrete example. I had a very close friend of mine up in the Boston area. They had come in after a weekend off, and one of their workstations was underneath a pipe that burst. The workstation got wet, and it completely died. Well, that workstation was attached to 4 different instruments here. It took them over 2 weeks to be able to get another workstation, get the software loaded and qualified onto that system in order for them to be able to use those 4 HPLCs. So during that entire 2-week period of time, they were down by those 4 HPLCs. Well, what happens if that happens to, let's say, this AIC instead? Well, if the same scenario happens here, because we are in a distributed environment, I can virtually move any of these instruments to any of the other AICs that have room on them, and I can be up and running in a matter of minutes instead of taking weeks to be up and running. Now, how about some advantages to just chemists or lab managers? Well, first of all, I can run any or all of these instruments from one single client. I don't have to go to this specific workstation to run this HPLC or this workstation to run this HPLC. Instead, I can run all of these instruments from one client. I can reprocess any results from any of my CDS clients. I can share methods, sequences, and reports across all of these instruments. Search to find results by metadata, like my compound name, X, Y, and Z, that was run on date ABC by this user. I have my lab at a glance, which shows me all of the instruments that I currently have access to in one window. And I can see if somebody is currently using an instrument prior to me sneaker netting over to the laboratory to see when I can use it. And then finally, I can even queue injections from any of my clients to run on any of these instruments. That's a very handy thing to have. Let's say one of my colleagues comes in. He sets up his 100 injection run to run overnight. It's going to end at 3 a.m. I don't want to have to come in the laboratory at 3 a.m. So instead, I can queue my injections to run immediately after his. And so immediately after his injections are done at 3, mine will begin immediately. One last item that I didn't actually include on this slide. It's actually probably the most important item of all. The one question I am asked more than any other question when I go into a laboratory, and I'll typically get this from lab supervisors or lab managers, is there a way for them, the lab supervisors or managers, to get an offline copy of the program in order to put it on their desktop computers or their laptops so they can not necessarily take up a seat in the laboratory, but be able to do data review and other things in satellite locations? The answer to that question is yes. However, let's give an example of ChemStation. If you want to do that in ChemStation, then you need to purchase an offline copy of ChemStation, which is about $4,000. And as soon as I give them the price tag, they say, forget it. Nobody in the organization is ever going to give me $4,000, so I don't have to walk into the lab. Here's the advantage of this type of a distributed environment. We do not charge you at all for these clients. That means that every person in the laboratory can have their own client sitting in the laboratory. They can have another client as their desktop computer in their office. And they can have a third client as their laptop computer that they can take home. And as long as their IT folks have given them a secure type into their system, they will have access to that from that point in time. We do not charge you anything extra for any of those clients. So every single organization can have one client or 1,000 clients, and it will not cost you any additional money at all. And again, given this distributed environment, because there's a central location where all of this data resides, it's going to be very easy for you to be able to grab that data,